My mom left for her new husband, but when he was jailed for fraud, I shut the door in her face. My name is Max. I'm 28 now, but this story began when I was 16. Life wasn't easy, but at least I had my mom. Linda, my mom, was everything after my parents divorced. We faced tough times, money problems, constant fights with my dad, who was more into his new opportunities than us. She always said I was her rock, that we were a team, and I believed her. Then Richard appeared. He was 34, looking like he'd stepped off a magazine cover. Expensive suit, groomed beard, a smile that made women swoon. He seemed carved from bronze, oozing confidence. Naturally, Linda fell hard. Her eyes lit up the first time he walked into our tiny apartment, like a prince arriving in a white Mercedes. In less than a month, he was pushing me out of the little world my mom and I shared. I went from being her son to just an obstacle, like a piece of furniture you don't need anymore. She laughed at his jokes, cooked fancy dinners for him, and brushed off my attempts to talk. Every day, our bond frayed as she got lost in his attention. One evening, I came home from school. Yeah, I was still playing by the rules, and they were sitting in the living room, holding hands like they'd hit the jackpot. I knew something was up. It felt like an incoming disaster, and of course, they gave me those fake smiles. "Max, we're getting married," Linda said, her voice bright with excitement, like a teenager with new car keys. My heart sank, but then came the real hit. "And Max, you'll need to find somewhere else to live." "What?" I was stunned. "Are you serious?" I managed to say, staring at her in disbelief. But Linda just looked at me like I was an annoying teenager ruining her fun. "You're old enough, Max," she said, like it was the most logical thing. "You need to be independent. Richard and I are starting a new life." That's when I knew I'd lost her. She chose him. This flashy Richard, who looked like a living watch ad, had taken the most important person in my life. I argued, shouted, begged her to remember we were a team. But she only saw me as a stubborn child, not facing reality. Her mind was made up. I was kicked out of my home. I remember standing outside with a suitcase, wondering what to do next. After all those years of supporting each other, she just shut me out, like flipping a switch. I'd never felt so alone and betrayed. After being kicked out, life was a horror movie with no happy ending in sight. For weeks, I lived like a contestant on some urban survival show, sleeping on benches, hoping I wouldn't wake up robbed or shoeless. Shelter smelled like someone had cooked soup from broken dreams and old socks. When I got lucky, I'd crash at friends' places on a beat-up mattress with cold pizza. Days were humiliating. In the city, you're someone or, like me, a nobody. Walk the streets penniless, and no one helps. I was just part of the background, a blur in the chaos. Benches were my beds, dumpsters my treasure chests, and soup kitchens my social clubs. I called my mom. I even texted, hoping she'd come around. Of course not. Her silence was like a slap, but I'd gotten used to pain. That's when Danny showed up, an old neighborhood friend. He found me on one of my royal benches. "Dude, you look like hell," he said. He offered me a spot at his tiny apartment. After the streets, it felt like a palace. Danny got me a job at the auto shop where he worked. At first I was a zombie, hungry, exhausted, barely standing. I passed out a couple of times, and Danny had to throw water on me to wake me up. But over time, I got stronger. Work became my routine. Danny's place was home, and he made me feel like I still mattered. Years passed, I got in shape, landed a permanent job at the shop, and became a regular guy. Money trickled in, enough to bring back some dignity buried under street trash. I felt like a survivor, like I'd outsmarted fate. Every morning, I'd look in the mirror and think, "You did it. You climbed out of that pit." When I heard that Richard ended up behind bars, I froze. The guy who flaunted his fancy watch and business genius was just a con man. His empire was a bubble of fake promises and shady investments. He swindled a lot of people, and when it all crashed, they dragged him out of his office like a thief. Seeing his mugshot in the news was priceless. Still arrogant, but with a hint of fear. A month later, I'd almost forgotten about it, when one evening there was a knock at my door. Expecting a neighbor, I was shocked to see my mother. The same woman who threw me out for her dream man. She looked terrible. Messy hair, dull eyes, a face that hadn't seen sleep or food in days. She stood there, shaking, barely able to speak. "Max, I don't know where to go." Can you imagine the satisfaction that welled up inside me? It was sweet revenge. "Oh, now you need my help?" I thought, seeing her exhausted face. My mom, who chose Richard over me, was now like a stray dog asking for help. For a second I thought it was a joke, but no, it was real. "Max, please, I don't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. I stood, leaning on the doorframe, feeling fury and confusion clash inside. I wanted to tell her she made her choice, that she was wrong, but I couldn't. In that moment I realized, no matter the betrayal, I couldn't slam the door in her face. With a sigh, I stepped aside and let her in. She passed by, nearly in tears, and I felt something break inside me. "What are you doing?" I thought, but she was still my mom. I shut the door and turned to face her, feeling the weight of it all. She sat on my old couch, hands clenched, afraid I'd kick her out. In that moment, I saw her. Not as the woman who left me, but as someone lost with nothing left. My mom stayed with me for a couple of weeks, even though I'd hoped it would just be a few days. She was clearly trying to show she could still be a mom. But honestly, her efforts were pathetic and completely fake. She cooked dinner straight out of a 70s housewife cookbook, cleaned the house like it was some kind of sacred ritual, and tried to talk to me in that caring mom tone. But I could see right through it, like looking through a dirty window. She was trying way too hard, and it only made things worse. Every time I came home, she'd greet me with a smile like nothing had ever happened. "Hey, honey, how was your day?" she'd ask, her voice like she was trying to convince herself everything was fine. I'd just give her a blank look and head to the fridge, because I had zero desire to talk. Sometimes she'd set a home-cooked meal in front of me, and I'd just sit there staring, not believing it was real. It felt like we were in some cheap sitcom, where everyone knew it was just an act, not real life. Of course, we started arguing. And not just arguing, full-on battles. I couldn't hold back the anger that had been building up all those years. She tried to say it was a mistake, that she'd been confused, in love, and that Richard had just charmed her. "Oh, really? He just charmed you, huh?" I'd snap back sarcastically, smirking as she tried to justify her betrayal. Her excuses sounded cheap, and every time she said how sorry she was, I felt the rage boiling inside me. It was like pouring gasoline on an already raging fire. I could literally see her trying to earn back the trust that had once existed. But instead, her words and actions only deepened my disgust. She'd go on about how she'd been in love back then and didn't know what she was doing, how her heart had led her to where she thought was best. "Yeah, right, your heart. More like your wallet." I'd snark whenever she launched into another lecture about her feelings. She'd look at me with pain in her eyes, but I just couldn't take her seriously. It was like she was reading from a script, and it went on like this every day. Fights became our routine. Every conversation would eventually turn into shouting. She'd try to tell me it was all a mistake, that she was confused, and I'd scream back that she'd made her choice the moment she kicked me out. All I saw in her excuses was weakness, a refusal to take responsibility for what she'd done. As if it was all just a mistake that could be fixed with a hot dinner and a clean house. But one night, as I was about to fall asleep, I heard her quietly crying in the bathroom. She'd locked herself in there, trying not to wake me, but the walls were thin as paper. I heard her sobs, trying to stifle the crying, and for a moment, something inside me softened. I even got out of bed and went to the bathroom door, but then everything froze inside me. I remembered those long cold nights when I was sleeping on the street, when I had nowhere to go, and she didn't even bother to answer my calls. All that pity evaporated, like morning mist. I went back to bed, pretending I hadn't heard a thing. The final explosion happened when I accidentally stumbled upon her chat with Richard's lawyer. Yeah, I definitely didn't mean to see it, but she'd left her laptop open on the kitchen table while she was making another cup of tea, as if nothing suspicious could possibly happen. And then, like in a bad movie, I saw a pop-up chat window. Words blurred before my eyes. Sentence reduction, appeal, support for early release. I started reading, and my blood boiled. She'd been secretly helping Richard try to get out of jail all these weeks. The guy who wrecked our lives, and she was still on his side. I wasn't just angry, I was furious. It felt like I'd been punched right in the gut. "Are you serious?" I shouted, practically throwing her phone onto the table so hard it nearly flew to the floor. My mom jumped, staring at me with a shocked expression. I saw her face go pale, like someone caught red-handed. "You're still choosing him, even now?" I couldn't stop yelling. It was too much. All her attempts to be better were shredded to pieces. She stood there, bewildered, like a schoolgirl caught in a lie. "Max, it's not what you think. I feel obligated to help him," she said, her voice shaking, and I saw the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yeah, sure, you feel obligated to help the guy who ruined your life." It was almost funny. "Oh, come on, save it!" I burst out, not believing a single word. Everything she said sounded like a lame excuse. "Obligation? You call that obligation? He destroyed your life. You threw me out for him. And even now, even after all this, you're still clinging to his dirty memory." I hurled words like stones to her face. She stood, gripping the edge of the table, shaking as if I was about to knock her down. I saw in her eyes a mix of fear and regret, but it didn't matter. She'd chosen him, again, even after everything that happened. It was the last straw I could handle. None of her tears, none of her excuses could ever bring back those years I spent alone. All her regrets were meaningless, because she still lived in the past, clinging to this man as if she couldn't breathe without him. "You can't let him go, can you?" I said quietly, looking her in the eyes. It wasn't a shout, not an accusation, just a statement of fact. I felt all the pain, all the rage retreating. In its place was a cold indifference. I couldn't keep this storm inside me, but I didn't want to scream at her either. "We're done," I said slowly, as if placing a period on each word. She collapsed onto a chair, covering her face with her hands, crying. But I didn't feel anything anymore. It wasn't my fault, not my problem. She made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. I turned and left, leaving her alone in the kitchen, where she was still trying to hold on to something that had long turned to dust. The next day, I realized that everything that had happened had completely drained my patience. I couldn't stand to see her in my apartment any longer. I just couldn't. I walked into the kitchen where she was sitting with a mug of cheap coffee, pretending everything might still work out. "We need to talk," I said abruptly, not sitting down. She looked at me with worry, like she instinctively knew something irreversible was about to happen. "I can't live with you under the same roof anymore," I blurted out, looking straight into her eyes. Panic flashed across her face, and then she started begging, her voice trembling as if she already felt her world crumbling. "Max, please don't do this. Give me another chance. I know I messed up, but I can't leave." She tried to grab my hands, holding them so tightly I could barely move. She was crying by the door, tears streaming down her face, but I just stood there, feeling my heart breaking into pieces. It was like trying to push a kitten out into the rain, but that kitten was a part of my past that I couldn't hold on to any longer. "It's too late for that," I said, trying to pull my hands free from her grip. She kept pulling me back, begging for one more chance, but everything inside me had already frozen. I didn't bother to explain anymore. I just went to her room, packed all her things into a suitcase and a couple of bags. It didn't matter how many times she tried to stop me. I wouldn't even look into her eyes, or I'd definitely lose it. Every sob, every pleading please was pulling me back. But I had already made my decision. She couldn't stay here anymore. When I got to the door, she clung to my hands again, crying so hard I thought she'd run out of tears. "Max, please don't do this. I'll make it right." I gently but firmly pushed her back, opened the door, and set her suitcase and bags on the doorstep. "You made your choice years ago. Now, this is my choice," I said, refusing to falter. She stood in the doorway, her hands trembling, her lips moving, but no words came out. I slammed the door in her face, hearing her collapse to her knees, screaming. She pounded on the door, begging me to open it, her cries echoing in my head. It felt like I wasn't just shutting a door but sealing my heart, closing it off from all the past that had haunted me for so long. I leaned against the wall, feeling everything tighten inside, like someone was slowly twisting a knife in my chest. I heard her banging on the door, trying to reach me, but I stayed firm. Eventually, she went quiet, her footsteps faded, and silence settled. I stood there, unmoving, feeling a weight in my chest, like something important had been ripped out of me. But I knew it was right. This was the door I shut not only on her, but on the past that could no longer be a part of my life. After she left, the house instantly felt empty. It was that strange emptiness where silence becomes deafening. I stood in my apartment, staring at the empty hallway, where her suitcase had been just moments ago, feeling a chill run through me. Like someone had turned off the light inside, and now I was alone in the dark. At first, I tried to convince myself that I'd made the right choice, but doubts lingered in my head. Maybe I was wrong? I thought, standing in the middle of the empty kitchen, which now seemed twice as big as before. I tried to distract myself, but every corner of the house reminded me of her. I couldn't sleep at night, tossing and turning, wondering if I'd shut the door too fast. But the truth was, I just couldn't keep living like before. She'd left too many scars to ignore. I knew there was no going back. So I decided. If there was no way back, I needed to move forward. I threw myself into work. The auto shop, which I'd built with my own hands, became my lifeline. It was my place, my territory, where I was the king. Cars don't betray you. They don't leave when things go wrong. They either run or they don't, and it all depends on how much you put into them. So I decided to put everything I had. I started expanding the business, hiring people who knew their craft but didn't pry into my life. We built a real hardcore team, guys with real skills who could bring any wreck back to life. Yeah, this was a shop with real spirit, not some glossy dealership for white-collar types, but a place where any old junker could roar back to life. Money started coming in. Slowly at first, then it turned into real cash flow. I opened up additional bays, bought a few new lifts, got some top-notch equipment, and even thought about renting a real fancy spot for expansion. The shop became the thing that kept me afloat, stopping me from sinking into depression. It was my business, my pride. I'd show up early in the morning, sometimes before anyone else, and stay late into the night when the city had already gone to sleep. The more I invested in the business, the less I thought about the past. It gradually became like a blurred photograph in the background, still visible, but no longer important. I started enjoying what I had. We built a loyal client base around the shop, and I made a name for myself. If someone wanted to bring an old Mustang back to life or tune up something really rare, they came to me. "Dude, you've got some serious skills," one of our new clients said, admiring his perfectly restored car. I just grinned and tossed him the keys. What did you expect? We're not amateurs here. Work became my life, and I loved it. I wasn't just the guy who'd lost his family anymore. I was a successful business owner who'd made it all on his own. People around me started to respect me, and I felt like I'd finally found my way. Everything that once seemed so important became just another page in the book I'd closed a long time ago. Now I stood stronger than ever before. Life had meaning again, and I knew I was finally in control of my own destiny, without those who had betrayed me. 5 years later, my life was unrecognizable. Now I was the successful owner of an auto shop, and every time I looked at my work, I was filled with pride. I'd built it all from scratch, literally on the ruins of my past, and now it was a place even the folks who used to ignore me would visit. My schedule was booked weeks in advance. Clients came in for rare parts, restorations, and to turn their rusty wrecks into masterpieces. One day, I was busy with another project when a beat-up old Toyota pulled into the shop. The car looked like it had been a rental back in the 90s and then forgotten. I didn't think much of it. Clients like that were pretty common here. But when I looked up at the driver, it was like I'd been hit by lightning. It was my mom. Time hadn't been kind to her. Gray strands threaded through her hair, her face looked tired and worn. At first, I didn't even recognize her. But then I saw her eyes. Those same eyes that once looked at me with love, and later, with indifference. Now, they were filled with sadness, and strangely, hope. I froze, not knowing what to do. She got out of the car slowly, as if every step was a struggle. She walked over to me without saying a word, and just handed me the keys. I noticed her hands were shaking, as if she was scared I'd turn around and walk away. All the old anger bubbled up inside me, but I stayed calm on the outside. Without a word, I took the keys, feeling a strange tension in the air. We stood there, in the middle of the noisy shop, in silence. I didn't know what to say, and it seemed like she didn't either. We just stood, staring at each other like two strangers fate had thrown together. It was strange, but I felt like I didn't hold a grudge against her anymore. Everything she'd done was long behind me, like a hazy memory of a bad night. This wasn't a moment where words could change anything. My mom didn't say a word. She just looked at me one last time and slowly turned away, walking back. I watched her get into the car and drive off, her figure disappearing around the corner, and a strange feeling of relief washed over me. I realized that I'd let go of the pain that had haunted me for so many years. I wasn't angry with her anymore, didn't expect anything from her, except silence. My past was behind me, and I stood there, surrounded by the sounds of engines, the noise of the shop, and the smell of motor oil, feeling like my new life had started the moment I'd shut that door in her face. I was a different person now, and that was my victory.